USDA logo, United States Department of Agriculture.
Okay, there we go. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Jamie Flem, Wikipedian-in-Residence and Outreach Specialist for the Agricultural Law Information Partnership at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. We will be recording today. This text will be in the chat for you to read it momentarily. Feel free to change your name if you wish. We will only be recording the speaker section. We won't record the editing session or the questions, so you can feel free to ask your questions freely. This is our agenda today. It's also on our Wikipedia page and on the Eventbrite if you want to take a look at that more closely. As always, please feel free to come and go as you wish. It's totally fine to only stay for the first part of this morning. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Wester, the Director of the National Agricultural Library. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jamie. As Jamie said, I'm Paul Wester. I'm the director here at the National Agricultural Library, and I want to welcome you to our Cooperative Agriculture Planning and Practice Wikipedia Edit-a-thon. Before we proceed any further, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the National Agricultural Library, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We're on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to the Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And again, hello and welcome to our event, Cooperative Agriculture Planning and Practice. I'm glad you could join us today. And again, my name is Paul Wester, and I'm the director here in Beltsville, Maryland at the National Agricultural Library. The National Agricultural Library, or NAL, was established in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, and today is one of 5 national libraries in the United States. We hold one of the most extensive food and agriculture-related collections in the world, serving USDA scientists and administrators, academic researchers, and the public. The library facilitates the creation of agricultural knowledge through the acquisition, curation, and dissemination of agricultural information. Today's event, as Jamie mentioned, was organized by the Agricultural Law Information Partnership, a collaboration between the National Agricultural Library, the National Agricultural Law Center, and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. I'd like to thank NAL Senior Law Librarian Kirsten Nelson for nurturing this partnership and helping to organize today's events. The Agricultural Law Information Partnership connects consumers, legal professionals, and producers with the agricultural and food law information they need. The International Cooperative Alliance defines a cooperative as an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Cooperative or collaborative agriculture allows farmers to pool resources and work together for mutual benefit. Cooperatives serve as a solution to bring long-term and meaningful economic development to urban and rural communities while increasing asset ownership and civic engagement. Resource sharing for mutual benefit is one of the main advantages of cooperative agricultural arrangements. Shared resources extend beyond the financial or the monetary to include farming practice, knowledge, skills, labor, equipment, infrastructure, land, and physical facilities. Black farmers and producers have long merged resources to create economic opportunity and to stimulate development. They have pooled resources through churches, fraternal organizations, mutual aid societies, and jointly owned businesses. Their cooperative efforts provide joint purchasing and marketing opportunities, revolving alternative loan funds, and benefits for those in need. Cooperative agriculture creates an opportunity to preserve family lands and creates purchasing power for land ownership and mutual assistance. Today, we will first hear from Terence Courtney, Director of Cooperative Development and Strategic Initiatives at the Federation for Southern Cooperatives. Mr. Courtney will highlight the Federation's history and work, offering insight into the power and positive impact of self-supporting communities and cooperatives. Our second speaker is Doug O'Brien, President and CEO of the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. He will discuss the procedural and legal issues involved in creating an agricultural cooperative. Following our speakers today, we will have a question and answer session. I would now like to say a few words about part 2 of today's event, the Wikipedia Edit-a-thon. The National Agricultural Library has had great success over the last 3 years improving the reliability of agricultural content on Wikipedia. This work helps ensure that the public has access to quality, accurate information where they're most likely to look for it first. Over the past 3 years, the National Ag Library has hosted edit-a-thons on a variety of topics, including USDA history, human nutrition and nutrition security, the Food Safety Modernization Act, heirs property, and food justice. Anyone interested in learning how to edit Wikipedia content, please return today at noon for the tutorial by Jamie. There'll be a short training session for new and inexperienced editors led by Jamie Flood, NAL's Wikipedian-in-Residence. And a special thanks also to Jamie for helping organize today's event and squaring away things with our speakers and our collaborators. The editing session today will run until a little bit before 3 p.m. While we hope you'll join us for the full day, please feel free to come and go as you please or as you need to, as Jamie said earlier in the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce Francine Miller, staff attorney at the Vermont Law School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, who will introduce Terence Courtney and his work with CAFs at Vermont and the Federation. So thank you, Fran, for offering the introduction today and being a great collaborator with us. And with that, I'll have you take it away.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you for allowing me to introduce Terence. I just wanted to highlight the work that we do with the Federation. I work closely with a colleague of Terence's, Dania Davey, on heirs property issues, and just really, really value the work that the Federation does and that we do together. So Terence Courtney is an equity advocate and organizer born and raised in Atlanta. He currently serves as the director, as Paul said, of cooperative development and strategic initiatives for the Federation. Side note, I know that Terence did a podcast with Dania, which you can look up on the Federation's podcast. It's a great podcast. His organizing work began with the Service Employees International Union to improve economic conditions for working people. He led union campaigns and later served as the union's rep for the state of Georgia. Terence co-founded and led coalitions such as Atlanta Jobs with Justice and the Atlanta Public Sector Alliance, a community group focused on the public sector. While working with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Terence organized both US-born and immigrants of African descent to educate and raise consciousness about immigrant rights and mass incarceration from a Black diasporic perspective. He co-developed and served as director of organizing at the Organization for Human Rights and Democracy and led development of the nonprofit's field strategy. He oversaw campaigns against school takeover and privatization, as well as a spinoff project, Cooperative Atlanta. I present to you Terence Courtney, organizer extraordinaire.
Wow. I'm extremely humbled by that introduction, Fran. And it gives me a great deal of pause. I have to get myself together. I'm very grateful for that. Very warm and powerful introduction. So I guess I'll go ahead and get started after my blushing. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well and really excited about this conversation we're having today. I'm excited about it. But before I go on with my comments, I really have to stop and give thanks. The Federation appreciates this invitation because you've given us an opportunity to exercise cooperative principles, the Rockdale Cooperative Principles, number 5 and number 7, where we have an opportunity to share information and knowledge while exercising our concern for community. But I think I can also add the cooperative principle number 6 as well, where it's our hope that this conversation leads to more interest and support for cooperatives, and if not, the outright development of new and emerging cooperatives throughout the South. So to the National Agricultural Law Center, to the Center for Agricultural Food Systems, the National Ag Library, Jamie Flood, Kirsten, Paul, I really loved your opening comments, and Fran, again, thank you for that introduction. So to everyone involved, I want to give you my warmest and deepest appreciation. So when I spoke with Jamie about talking with you today, I asked her about the audience. I wanted to get some sense of who I'd be talking with. And she told me some of the people present would be folks from extension agencies, extension professionals, lawyers, information professionals, folks representing 1890s and members of the general public. And when I thought about that, I asked myself, wow, you know, what could this high level, educated, very sharp crowd really want from me on the subject of cooperative development? But what Jamie helped me to understand is that, you know, even though that's the case, there are quite a few people who are really unfamiliar with cooperatives as a concept. So this is when I understood the importance of being a part of this conversation. The lack of knowledge about cooperative businesses, especially as accessible opportunities for farmers in rural communities to improve their lives, is truly a pervasive problem. But I guess the question is, for a lot of people, is why does that even matter? I think it matters because from the Federation's perspective, cooperatives are one of the most accessible and successful tools for the exercise of economic democracy by grassroots communities. Co-ops provide a means to pool resources. This is something Paul mentioned, and it's true. It enables people to pool their talents. It enables the creation of economies of scale that lead to, among other things, we hope, the building of collective and community wealth. I think you and I can agree that in our current era of inflated prices, economic insecurity, pandemics, and climate change, that a tool that enables farmers and rural communities to better ride out economic downturn, and in some cases, prosper, is something worth talking about. So our answer to the question of, does this matter, really stems from the lessons we've learned as an organization in our experience. Going back about 55 years, during the late 60s in the South, despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, racist regimes were still in effect in the South, and the chances for racialized violence were palpable. Civil rights workers at that time, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often called SNCC, and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, went into these rural areas. And I'd like to say, in many ways, they were themselves transformed by the people they encountered. They met communities who were, yes, still oppressed by racist laws and economic exploitation. However, these same people demonstrated a capacity to not only withstand these cruel injustices, but develop at a very basic level the future model for the organization. cooperatives. Many of these Black farmers were also Black landowners who wrestled with the additional problem of an ongoing and systemic program by local and national forces to rob Black families of land they had earned and that they had the right to own. And so in 1967, 22 cooperatives from across the South came together here in Atlanta to ratify the charter that became the foundation for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. Today, we've grown to more than 70 cooperatives owned and operated by Black farmers, landowners, residents, and workers. It was at this convention of cooperatives 55 years ago that members decided on our mission to be a catalyst for the development of self-determining communities through cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. But essentially, what those founders were talking about was advancing economic justice to create conditions for more freedom and self-determination. Here are a few things that I think made the Federation unique, even among its contemporaries of that time. One, the 22 businesses that came together chose not to operate in what we call today silos. They recognized that operating in isolation hindered their chances at long-term sustainability, let alone prosperity. Two, early on, organizers intersected issues of racial justice and economic justice with a bottom-up approach to organizing. Three, the organizing centered in Black rural communities, whereas most of what we hear about in history took place in urban centers. Four, Black women were central to the work and held key leadership roles both in local cooperatives and the emerging regional structure. And five, Black farmers were the core membership from the very beginning. So those early members and staff of the Federation were clear about this intersection of race and class. And the work that they engaged put them in a position where they were fighting multiple forces. They endured a multitude of hardship and outright attacks that nearly shut the doors. The Federation lived to fight on, however, and we grew. But sadly, in many communities throughout the South, the relics of Jim Crow live on. Not only that, in 2022, we have anti-Black forces actively blocking policies and legislation designed to provide a measure of economic relief to Black farmers. Moreover, we're witnessing in real time a resurgence of overt white supremacist organizing, which no doubt has an objective, the realization of their worldview through policy. This is arguably an era where cooperatives can play a pivotal role in anchoring more economic freedom and democracy in communities positioned in the sights of those who would operationalize an authoritarian and antiquated agenda on all those they deem as an other or unworthy. The Federation believes everyday people still need pathways to improve their lives. And that's really at the heart of the Federation's mission. When we talk about cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy, we're talking about providing tools for empowerment, tools for sustainability, tools ultimately for the expansion of freedom. So I've talked about co-ops, but I do recognize, as I said earlier, that there may be people on this Zoom who are unfamiliar with what co-ops are. I think Paul kind of gave a good sketch of what co-ops are all about, and I'd like to add to that. So, when we think about cooperative businesses, how would you define them? And I think the way I would answer that question, or the way the Federation would answer that question, is A cooperative is a business formed and joined on a voluntary basis. It's collectively owned by its members who come together to meet a need. For the Federation, meeting an identified need is the primary motivation for starting or joining a cooperative. Whereas with traditional businesses, the only concern may be to what degree high profits can be returned to investors in the shortest amount of time. And let's elaborate more on the differences between co-ops and traditional business models. Co-ops espouse shared and collective ownership of a business, whereas with traditional businesses, ownership is often in the hands of one person or a tiny elite. In a co-op, each member gets one vote, and decision-making is shared and equitable. Whereas in traditional businesses, they may be ruled by one man or, again, a tiny elite. For a co-op, democracy, equity, and fairness are at the center of labor relations, whereas unequal and exploitive power relations define the dynamic in a traditional business. So if you and I view these distinctions through economic and social justice lenses and filter through values such as sharing, inclusion, and even, yes, love, then co-ops clearly stand out as the superior system for organizing a business. This is not to say that cooperatives are perfect. They are not. And if we're honest, there are many cooperatives that fall short. But that said, at least we can say cooperatives have a basic and defined framework for the exercise of positive values. For co-ops, there are ostensible principles to govern practices. But there's another area of confusion that needs clarifying, and that is the difference between co-ops and nonprofits. I mention this because countless times I've had conversations with people who see them as more or less the same thing. And so one of my jobs has become to disabuse the public of that notion. One of the reasons for the mix-up, I believe, is both cooperatives and nonprofits are often formed to perform some social good. But there are at least two fundamental matters that separate a co-op from a nonprofit: profits and ownership. Co-ops are businesses ideally designed with a business plan that leads to generating collectively owned profits or surpluses. Nonprofits are charity-dependent organizations not designed to make a profit. Cooperatives are business owned by members, and consequently, if that business fails, the dissolved assets are returned to the membership. In a nonprofit, if it fails, its assets must be donated to other nonprofits. Members do not own a nonprofit. I think these differences demonstrate that cooperatives are also a more strategic option for people concerned with not just fulfilling a need or performing some social good, but for building economic power that creates conditions for self-sustainability and ultimately self-determination. I mentioned earlier that co-ops technically are built upon a certain set of principles. Here's a list for those unfamiliar. 1, voluntary and open membership. 2, democratic member control. 3, member economic participation. 4, autonomy and independence. 5, education and training. 6, cooperation among cooperatives. And 7, my favorite, concern for community. Now, I'd like to share an example of a Federation cooperative that I think embodies what I've been talking about. This cooperative meets a definite need while operating by co-op principles. The Indian Springs Farmers Association, formed in 1976, came together to help African-American farmers sell vegetables to a wider market. In the last 46 years, Indian Springs has become an important regional vendor, bringing a rich array of in-season vegetables to markets in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama every week. 45 members own this vegetable and production marketing cooperative. It grades, packs, ships, and moves produce for African-American farmers. Indian Springs owns a state-of-the-art packing facility located in Petal, Mississippi, along with a cooler for storage, washing tubs, sorting tables, and other equipment for processing the produce from co-op members. Members purchase shares and pay annual membership dues. To fulfill its marketing goals and contracts, the co-op also affiliates with at least 4 other cooperatives in the state. This cooperative, Indian Springs, helps to secure higher prices through collective bargaining and access to greater marketing opportunities, more so than any one member could achieve on her or his own. The Indian Springs Farmer Association uses democratic decision-making through voting at regularly scheduled board and member meetings. Indian Springs has helped local farmers sustain themselves through 46 years of ups and downs, and they've worked with farmers to mitigate land loss. I also like to talk about some of our other successes as a cooperative. I will define those in 2 buckets or 2 baskets, if you will. One is an interpersonal, maybe farmer-based basket. The second is more of an institutional framework. When we think about the interpersonal support and success that we've had as an organization, I think it's a powerful statement to be able to say that, we've been able to use our legal support and advocacy to save Black land from the systemic erosion that has occurred over the last century. We've been using cooperatives to aggregate and collectively market goods produced by individual farmers, creating and sustaining incomes and oftentimes increasing incomes. And we've created local jobs for individuals through cooperative development. Finally, our cooperatives have been able to provide ongoing technical assistance and training to farmers to help them improve the individual operations of their farms. But I'd like to say arguably the more influential successes have been those that occurred at the institutional level. Think about this. We've been able to create and sustain a 55-year-old institution of scores of cooperatives that has withstood political and financial attacks from local and national forces. We've been responsible for spearheading the creation of programs that have directly benefited farmers of color and women farmers, such as the 2501 grant. We've led the way on the Pickford Black Farmer lawsuit to raise awareness about systemic Black land loss and to recoup, at least in a small measure, some of the resources that have been extracted from our communities. And we've been winning victories in democratizing rural electric cooperatives. These successes notwithstanding, there remain enormous challenges around which we must struggle. For example, we've identified 2 big barriers to the growth of cooperatives in the South. The first is a structural barrier. For example, we lack enabling legislation here in the South to really protect and codify cooperative development. Cooperatives are excluded from small business administration loans due to the collective ownership structure of cooperative businesses. And the NCUA, the National Credit Union Administration, has put limitations on cooperative development in the area of credit unions by putting stipulations on the size and financial holdings of cooperatives, really negating that as an option for small communities and grassroots communities. The other barrier I would describe as almost social or generational, where we have an aging farmer population combined with, in some cases, disinterested heirs, which has set the stage for an existential crisis in the future of Black farming. Also, we are wrapped in the midst of a contradiction where on one hand, we're seeing a growing interest among young Black people in farming, but oftentimes these communities are landless and can't actualize this intent. So our strategy to overcome these obstacles is pretty straightforward in its concept. Number one, over the next 5 years, we will deepen and expand our cooperative development work across 7 states. Number two, we're going to be putting greater investment into regional marketing capacity and building infrastructure. And number three, we're redoubling our efforts as it relates to land retention and advocacy. So the plan clearly is very straightforward. What's going to be complicated is the execution of the plan. And I think that's where this opportunity is especially appreciated, because I believe that strong relationships and what people call today ecosystems are going to be critical to helping the Federation navigate these obstacles to fulfill its mission. This is one of the reasons, again, why I look forward to this conversation, because it's my belief that you can play a role in that. I hope you found my remarks informative, but I think there's room for people like you to take action. Here are a few things that I think you can do to support the cooperative development movement in the South and the Federation. If you or someone you know is interested in cooperative development, let's make a connection. Contact the Federation. Also, you can make a contribution to our annual events, such as the annual meeting coming up in August. In October, we have an annual cooperative education event, a 3-day event we call Co-op Econ. And then in December, we have a land retention conference. All of these we invite your people to participate in and support. Also, I think you can speak with your institutions you represent, to get them to think about supporting and partnering with the Federation. And of course, I would like for you to continue to support the work that Dania Davies leading, and to support our efforts at advocacy to help promote cooperative development as a real option for communities oppressed by any number of issues. So I think I'll wrap up my comments with that. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and some of the back and forth. But again, I want to give thanks to everyone involved that's brought this event together, for inviting the Federation to speak and to share. And I just look forward to hearing Doug and talking more with you. Thank you again, and let's build cooperatively.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Terence, for your remarks this morning. I've got lots of questions, and we will get to them when we get to the question and answer part. But I would like to transition over to Doug now, and his bio is in the chat, but I will read it again for everybody. So I'd like to introduce Doug O'Brien. He works with the cooperative community, both domestically and internationally, to deepen their impact and influence. The National Cooperative Business Association is the primary voice for cooperatives in the U.S. for using the cooperative business model to empower people in their businesses and communities. Doug has been with the NCBA since 2016 and became president and CEO in January of 2018. Before coming to the NCBA CLUSA, Doug led the work of the White House Rural Council and served in top positions at the USDA. Doug has also worked in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and for 2 governors. Doug's experience in academia includes teaching and writing at the University of Arkansas and the Drake University Law School. Doug was raised on a diversified farm in Dubuque County, Iowa, and holds degrees from Loras College in Dubuque and the University of Iowa Law School and the University of Arkansas Masters in Agricultural Food Law program. So welcome back for that piece as part of our collaboration here at NAL with the folks there at the Law Center. Doug lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just down the way from us here in Beltsville, with his wife Alyssa and 3 children. And thanks for being here, Doug, especially on our challenging day of weather. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Paul, thanks so much. And it really is a pleasure to be with NAL. As you mentioned, I've had opportunity through my career to collaborate with NAL and to use the services, particularly when I was doing ag law research, when I was a colleague of yours at USDA. It's really good to be back with the USDA folks. So I really value the work that NAL does. And I love what you're doing with the Wikipedia edit-a-thon. And I know that's work that I think it just makes so much sense. And I'll say that as someone who spends a lot of time navigating the internet, sometimes Wikipedia, and I run into different things about cooperatives. And in fact, the content isn't that great sometimes. And I love that NAL has taken it upon itself to kind of to coordinate and to help make sure that content is good. So thank you, Paul. And Terence, always great to be with you. Always great to be with the Federation. The Federation actually is a longtime member of the National Cooperative Business Association, one of the leaders for the entire co-op community here in the United States. Terence did a fantastic job talking about their legacy and more importantly, probably the impact that they're set to do in the future as we look to use cooperatives to build a more inclusive economy, which is the vision of NCBA CLUSA. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today about, I'm going to be pretty quick because Terence did a fantastic job kind of laying out some of this stuff. And if you can move to the next slide, my objectives, I'll just start moving through them, are to do very quickly a general introduction to cooperatives here in the United States, very quickly, describe kind of the basic co-op development ecosystem, delve into the concepts of user ownership, control, and benefit. And I want to mention that's one of the ways that people look at cooperatives. And it's a framework that was created by the U.S. Department of Agriculture many years ago. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we're going to jump into a few issues around the legal landscape. So I will be coming at this from a little bit of a lawyer's lens. And then as time allows, I'll just touch on a few of the contemporary issues around cooperatives, a few of those that Terence has already touched on. So next slide. I'll just talk a bit about NCBA CLUSA very quickly. Our mission is to develop, advance, and protect cooperative enterprise. We've been around for 106 years. And our vision, it's the vision we've had for 5 or 6 years, is to ensure more people can use cooperatives to build a more inclusive economy that's more equitable, that's more sustainable, that is more stable, and one that grows for everyone. So that's our vision at NCBA CLUSA, and our members are cooperatively owned businesses and their associations. Next slide. I did want to just lay out 3 really basic resources when you think about farmer cooperatives. And the first is U.S. Department of Agriculture. It has the legacy cooperative services that now resides and has for many years at the Rural Development Mission Area. And that's where the expertise on farmer cooperatives from the government, and really ever since, well, certainly in the 1930s when the federal government took on cooperatives is one of the strategic imperatives to help rural communities, and in particular farmers, and then rural electric cooperatives, which I'll talk about a little bit. There's an association, a national association farmer cooperatives called the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. Certainly wanted to highlight that they're an important resource for farmer cooperatives, and then the National Cooperative Business Association is us. And I have to mute because of this. Sorry about that. Next slide. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. So cooperative distinction. Terence basically laid this out. So and this is this three-part kind of a three-legged stool of cooperatives. They're user-based. That's what makes them really different, and that's sort of the magic of why they can do the amazing things that Terence talked about in terms of they can be a force for both economic and societal empowerment. But how does that happen? What's so special about these businesses? They are owned by the people who use the business. They're controlled in a democratic way by the people who use that business, and then they benefit the users. And we'll get into the detail of what that looks like. Next slide, please. First, talk a little bit about the cooperative impact and why people, use co-ops as a solution machine. One of my board members used that phrase. I love that phrase. They address market failures. So probably the classic example in the late 19th century when farmers in an agrarian economy, as that economy was becoming more industrial, farmers were losing their place in the market, and they were able to use cooperatives to come together to get to scale so that they could have access to the market once again. They very closely related. Cooperatives help small players gain parity. As the USDA knows very well, that farmers are typically price takers. They have very little. One farmer against a major buyer or corporation has very little market power. When farmers come together and are able to get to that scale, both in terms of numbers and size, but also business sophistication, they do a lot better. So that last one is it gives consumers a deliberate choice. We find more and more, I think, really to many of Terence's points, people are interested on where their food comes from, where their food and fiber comes from, and we think it's really important that consumers have the ability to choose businesses and to purchase goods from businesses that are run in a more value-based way, a principled way, like cooperatives. Next slide, please. Just a few very quick examples of cooperatives before we go deep into farmer cooperatives. And the point here is that cooperatives they're not like a marginal thing. They're a big deal, particularly in rural America, but also in urban America. So co-ops provide electricity to 20 million households and businesses. About well over 50%, I think almost 60% of the United States landmass is served by utilities that are owned and controlled by the people who use that electricity. That's the rural electric cooperatives. Financial services credit unions are financial cooperatives. There's over 100 million people who are members of these financial cooperatives. Importantly, when you think about financial services, farmers have the Farm Credit System, which is a government-sponsored entity that Congress sponsored, created in 1917, that basically farmers own a very significant, very large financial system cooperatively, and the Farm Credit System. And then very quickly, cooperatives are used in housing cooperatives through home ownership. More and more, we see worker-owned cooperatives. That's the fastest growing and one of the smaller sectors at the moment, but one of the faster growing. Cooperatives, of course, provide healthy food to communities with that kind of the classic consumer co-op, the Tacoma Park Silver Spring Co-op, which I'm a member of just a couple miles away. I own and have some measure of control on my grocery store, on my consumer-owned co-op. And then purchasing, like Ace Hardware stores, each of those small business owners are members of a cooperative, so they can compete with the big box stores. And then, of course, marketing and process of ag products, which we're going to go more deeply in. Next slide, please. So farmer cooperatives, a few data points here. It's from 2019, and this is USDA data. There's nearly 2,000 or nearly 1,800 farmer cooperatives in 2019, and well over 9,000 locations across the country. Really, in every state, you see farmer-owned cooperatives, with probably a major concentration in the upper Midwest, but certainly throughout the country. The net business volume of $180 billion that have gone through these farmer-owned businesses, and the main commodities are grain, petroleum, dairy, and fruits. So it's just about in every type of commodity. Next slide. Just a few brand names that just to give a sense of the scale and the familiarity of farmer cooperatives. I'm not going to read those out. They're pretty darn familiar. You've got the Federation there, right smack dab in the middle. But those other brands are ones that are some of the most familiar in your different grocery store aisles. Next slide. So the cooperative ecosystem, just to kind of think about the basic landscape of cooperatives. There's cooperative development. I talk about cooperation. I mentioned Cooperation Works there. That's another resource I could have included. That's the association, the group of co-op development organizations. And forming a cooperative is actually probably a little more challenging than forming other types of businesses. And that's because the people who use the business, the members of the cooperative, not only own, and we're going to get into this, but they need to have some type of governance and control. And so, the investment is not only financial, but it's actually, it's governance as well. And that means it takes a little bit more to organize these types of businesses. On the other side of the coin, once the businesses are formed as a cooperative, they tend to be more resilient. They last longer. And that's because, I believe, because the people, the members, they have a deeper understanding, a deeper loyalty, and they have, an investment beyond financial in the success of that cooperative. Another couple other quick, entities within this co-op ecosystem is financing. I mentioned the farm credit system. CoBank is a part of that farm credit system. It's a major bank that finances agriculture cooperatives as well as much of the other rural infrastructure. And then technical assistance from the government. USDA, as I mentioned, has that core kind of function, and it has for generations at the Cooperative Services at Rural Development. They have some fantastic resources there over at Cooperative Services. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about the three major distinctions using that paradigm of the USDA: user ownership, user control, and user benefit. So first, ownership. What's that mean? It's pretty straightforward in some ways. It means that the members, they either, they put direct investment. They invest $100, $10,000, if it's a capital intensive business. So that's one way. Another way is debt. So they, a co-op can borrow money. It can be a little more difficult to borrow money, particularly if one's looking at SBA. Terence talked about that. The challenge is working with the Small Business Administration, which we're working on trying to improve. Retain margins, per unit capital retains, and those two essentially they're different flavors of when a sale occurs, the co-op is able to capture some of that profit to invest it back in the business, essentially. And then preferred stock, an important option to mention. It's preferred because those who own the stock receive the dividend or the patronage first before the users. But very importantly, there's no voting for this type of stock, and it's a common strategy for agriculture farmer-owned co-ops who are looking for an infusion of capital, that they'll invite investors through preferred stock, non-voting stock. Very importantly. Next slide. So then we have user control. We talked about democratic. What's that really mean? It means that the directors of the cooperative are elected by the members. One person, one vote. So there might be one farmer that puts through, 100 bushels through the cooperative, and another one puts 10,000 bushels through the cooperative. Each of them have one vote. One farmer might invest $100, another one invests $10,000. One member, one vote. A key distinction of cooperatives. The members control, major governance policy changes through the articles of incorporation or the bylaws. And then if there's major corporate actions such as dissolution, sale, a merger, then the members get a vote on that. Next slide. And then finally, user benefit, that third leg of the three-legged stool on the next slide, focuses on patronage. That's a special, in other contexts, people would say that the profit or the dividend, and in co-ops, it's called the patronage. It's based on use and not an investment. That's really another important distinction. So back to that example of one farmer puts 100 bushels through the co-op, the other one 10,000 bushels. That farmer who put 10,000 bushels, he's going to get that dividend, that profit based on use. He's going to get 100 times more than that farmer who only put 100 through. So that's how patronage works. And then there is non-patronage dividend for that preferred stock. So next slide. And I noticed this morning I have the labels on these two columns backwards. So I was testing myself, I guess, maybe testing the audience here. But cooperatives, so C corporations are actually the one on the left, cooperatives the one on the right. This is sort of a quick review. Maybe I won't even go through it real quickly. Again, C corporations and other types of corporations, control is based on investment. Cooperatives, one person, one vote. Capital for C corporations is usually from outside investors who don't even necessarily use or the business or part of the community. For cooperatives, most of the capital comes from the people who use the business. Earnings for C corporations and other corporations based on investment, earnings and patronage for cooperatives based on use, and taxes we're going to talk about in a little bit. For many types of corporations, C corporations in particular, they're taxed at a couple levels, co-ops taxed at one level. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about the legal landscape of farmer cooperatives. And I just want to pause and kind of think about and talk for a moment about why cooperatives are treated differently in different policy regimes. It is a recognition of policymakers that cooperatives are different. Their very nature of the users, the members, being at the center of that business means that it only makes sense that they get treated differently in some of these different areas. Another reason is that policymakers understand that this special kind of business provides greater benefit, greater public benefit, in particular for populations that have a hard time accessing the economy, historically marginalized populations, poor populations. And so policymakers are interested in making sure that these types of businesses can be successful. So you can see the four areas that we're going to touch on in terms of some legal and procedural issues. Next slide. So state and corporation statutes, again, Terence talked about this. It's not that these types of statutes are not consistent across the country in the 50 states in our federal system, but co-ops are a special type of corporations. And corporations are simply creatures of state law. It's the state legislature at some point saying that people can come together and form this business, and they need to do, they need to file articles in corporations, and they need to do some certain things, and then they get some benefit, which is typically one of the most, the greatest benefits is a protection from personal liability. So the personal liability of each member for losses suffered by a cooperative is limited to the member's equity in the cooperative. So If the cooperative has super significant losses or create some type of liability through through some type of accident or disaster, the farmer member will the most that person could lose is what they have invested in the cooperative. That's that protection of personal liability. Another reason that people incorporate as cooperatives is the transfer of ownership and control is simple. So new members, to take on new members, they typically just buy or they pay a membership dues to as an initial investment into the cooperative, and then they're a member of the cooperative. They have voting rights and the ability to take advantage of patronage dividends. So that's real simple. Other types of businesses, it's much harder to bring people into it. And then when a person is no longer eligible to be a member, they no longer are a farmer, that cooperative repurchases that membership interest. Very simple process. So that's another reason. And then the third reason to incorporate is the corporation conveys to members and outsiders that image of a solid, long-standing, sustainable business. So those are some three great reasons to incorporate as a cooperative. As Terence mentioned, many states, and in particular in the Southeast, lack comprehensive incorporation statutes. It's a significant challenge in those jurisdictions. It makes it more of a challenge for people to use cooperatives and to incorporate cooperatives, depending on the type of cooperative and how they want to use that cooperative. So next slide. Federal income tax. This actually, this could be, I literally have a treatise of 1,100 pages from Jim Barta, who is formerly at Cooperative Services at USDA and was a professor of mine at the University of Arkansas, on co-op tax. It can be a very complicated endeavor to describe all the different topics, but very generally, the federal income tax for cooperatives is that if co-ops are taxed either at the corporate level, or co-ops are taxed at the corporate level or at the individual level, and not on both. So that's true as long as the business is operating on a cooperative basis. And for the U.S. government, particularly for the IRS, cooperative basis means that patronage is distributed based on how much the member used the business. And then they get this tax advantage relative to other businesses. And again, it only makes sense that co-ops are treated this way because of that integral relationship between the users of the business and the business itself. Next slide. Federal antitrust and the Capper-Volstead Act. Got a couple of slides here. In general, people I think know that federal antitrust law, particularly the Sherman Act, it prohibits individuals or firms from agreeing on price or other significant terms. That's one of the most fundamental characteristics of our antitrust law here in the United States. Well, think about how that would apply to farmer cooperatives. Many times the reason the farmers want to get into a cooperative is so that they can market their goods jointly, so they can get to that scale that we talked about before. So Congress recognized exactly 100 years ago, in 1922, that farmers should have an opportunity to market their products jointly, and they passed something that has become known as the Capper-Volstead Act, and it states that farmers may act together in processing and marketing agricultural products. It requires a couple things. First, that co-op be governed with a one member, one vote governance policy, and it limits dividends on stock to 8% per year. So as long as those two things are met, farmers can use that exemption from the Sherman Act. Now, importantly, the Capper-Volstead Act does say that the cooperative, or they call it the association, may not monopolize or restrain trade. Next slide. A couple issues around the Capper-Volstead Act is that courts have held that the act does not apply, so that is, farmers cannot use that exemption to situations where the co-op conspires with a non-co-op. So this is designed for co-op to co-op business and member to member business. It also, that waiver would not apply to a co-op that has non-farmers as members. And that's what, yikes, even if there's one non-farmer. So if you have a cooperative that, and you have somebody who isn't actually a farmer that's part of that cooperative, then the entire cooperative and all its members could be kicked out of that exemption that capital Volstead provides. And then finally, if the co-op engages in predatory conduct. Next slide. Thank you. You were reading my mind. Thanks, Jamie. Contemporary issues. And this is almost the last slide. I don't have slides on each of these, so I'm just going to touch on each of these really briefly. And if there's interest in folks talking about it, we can, I want to save time for the conversation that we're going to have with Terence here in just a few minutes. So what are some of the major issues that surface today for farmer cooperatives? Access to capital and outside investment control. So this is a big issue. As I mentioned, we talked about a number of times already today. Co-ops, they put capital in a subsidiary position. They put people in a priority position. And one of the results of that is that capital, for instance, people who control capital, and they want some type of control of that business. If they're going to invest in the business, they're not going to invest in a cooperative because they don't get control unless they're a member user of that cooperative. That makes it a little bit more difficult to access capital. There are ways that that cooperatives have been very successful at accessing capital. We talked about preferred stock, there's other strategies, but that's one of the issues. And that issue leads to sort of a dynamic where some entities, they're looking for ways to provide some level of control to non-member investors so that they can access more capital. So that's an issue. Board composition is an issue in some places, particularly for some of the both the bigger, more sophisticated co-ops that they're interested in having representation from outside experts. Really importantly, Terence mentioned another issue around board representation is making sure that the co-op has the processes in place so that all the members really do have access to running for the board, and that there's a really healthy democratic process, something that the Federation is working on, a really important work. And then finally, on board composition, another issue is that in some areas that where nonprofits, many times very well-meaning nonprofits, they're interested in having some type of control if they want to invest in the cooperative, and that's an issue of non-member representation. The next item there is limited cooperative associations. This is a term that that is becoming a little bit more well-known. Essentially, it's an entity that arguably is a misnomer, but it's an entity that has some version of democratic control. Maybe 50, 60, 70, 80% is democratically controlled, but then there's a percentage, 20, 30, 50% of the entity that is controlled by by non-members, whether that's investors or maybe it's other community folks, and that's known as a limited cooperative association. And then there's many in the cooperative world question whether they can be called truly a cooperative, as opposed to maybe just some type of democratically controlled organization. Consolidation is a big issue in agriculture, as well as a number of other sectors, credit unions in particular. But many external market forces are moving the agriculture, the farmer-owned cooperatives to consolidate. We see that quite a bit throughout the countryside. Benefit corporations, I think I'll skip. And the last one is member data. I'll just mention that I think that one of the great uses within farmer cooperatives today is making sure that farmers can capture the value of their data. That, of course, is the data is becoming, in many ways, one of the more lucrative or more, value-based commodities that are that are being created in farmer-owned cooperatives, and we see some good examples of cooperatives making sure that their farmers, are able to analyze, use that data to create more value, and then I think there's some others where there's some real potential to really serve their members in a better and a more robust way. Next slide. I want to mention, and particularly with Terence here, that NCBA CLUSA is involved as a cooperator, and that is that we have a cooperative agreement with USDA to help support historically underserved farmers, and there's a number of these cooperative agreements that were announced a number of months ago. The one that NCBA CLUSA is involved in is helping to build up the cooperative development ecosystem for all types of historically underserved farmers. We're working closely with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and others on this project, but it's something we're really excited at NCBA CLUSA because it fits our vision of using cooperatives to build a more inclusive economy so well. So happy to talk more about the cooperative agreement if that's interest. And next slide. I think the next slide is thank you. Again, just so much appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I look forward to the question and answer and the comment. So back to you, Paul.
Awesome, Doug. Thanks so much for that great presentation. And we're going to jump to the question and answers now. And I was going to ask you like a dozen questions about data management and the cooperative environment, Doug, but maybe I'll do that another time. But I've got some other ones I wanted to jump in first with Terence on. First, Terence, how does the Federation deal with local and state laws and policies that are trying to limit the progress made by Black farmers and producers?
Well, I guess through our advocacy work, but I would describe that occurring at high and low levels. At the highest level, people like Dania Davey, our Director of Land Retention and Advocacy, kind of spearheads our efforts around policy and advocacy changes, be that some of what Doug mentioned, such as moving the needle on enabling legislation, but also dealing with debt relief for Black farmers, the future farm bill, et cetera. But then more so at the grassroots level in local communities, cooperatives are actually really part of the local ecosystems. That's one of the special things about our cooperatives. In rural places like Livingston, Alabama, and Epps, Alabama, and Petal, Mississippi, cooperatives don't just perform this economic function we're talking about. They've been a part of local politics in as much as they have supported candidates that support cooperative development, and those candidates go on to try to improve local issues in a broad array of ways. I think that's how at the local level our cooperatives are trying to improve conditions. But the fact is, when you talk about these barriers to cooperatives, it's really a big problem. It's in some respects a federal issue because our attempts to change conditions at the state level have been thwarted. For example, we spent 6 years in Mississippi working on enabling legislation there, and what the members and staff of the Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, the association to which Indian Springs belongs, what they tell us is that, from year to year, support for enabling legislation for cooperatives curiously switched aisles. So 1 year you may have bigger support for enabling legislation on the Republican side, on another on the Democratic side. But what was really interesting was at no time were the support either from the Republicans or Democrats large enough to overcome the bipartisan opposition to cooperatives. And what they found is enabling legislation, I should say. And what they found is that much of that is rooted in a historic antipathy for anything that collectively organizes labor and working families and working people. And you could throw cooperatives and unions as part of that. So it's a very complicated problem, but I think we work to deal with that at high and low levels.
So thank you, Terrence. I'm gonna transition over to you, Doug, and I was wondering if you could speak to, are there any particular industries or geographies that have more co-ops, and is there a reason for that? Because you talk about a lot of different types of them. I was wondering if you could comment on the particular industries and where they're at and where the concentrations are.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. Just sticking to agriculture, as I said, they're really, I mean, they are pretty ubiquitous. Cooperatives are. I think in terms of the percentage within the commodity, dairy is probably the highest. I mean, some of the numbers that we've seen, the USDA numbers again, historical numbers are that probably 80% of the dairy products that are consumed in the United States are at least some point touched by or were part of, owned by, processed by a farmer-owned cooperative. But in the upper Midwest, historically, that's where farmer cooperatives got their first anchor, and I think actually it's just part of the historical kind of dynamic of Northern European farmers in the late 1800s were settling in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa, and cooperatives is a known strategy from their from their countries of origin. As Terence said, that's one story of cooperatives. The Rockdale, which is right outside of Manchester, England, 1844, they put a number of principles together. It's just one story of cooperatives. The Native Americans in the United States, what became the United States, they use and continue to use cooperative economics in a very sophisticated way. Terence mentioned, I think, that enslaved people that were forced to come to the United States, many of them came from communities with highly sophisticated cooperative economies that are probably more connected to some communities than the Rochdale. So I think there's a lot of different roots to the cooperatives. One other I'll mention is California. Those more typically specialty fruits and vegetables. Many of those are it's mostly cooperative. Blue Diamond is a great example. Sunkist is another great example. And there was a movement in I think it was the 1930s. They're a little bit different flavor of cooperative, but they are definitely important cooperatives in the United States.
Cool. Thank you very much, Doug. To Terence, I have a question. It is, has Indian Springs been an inspiration for other Black farmer co-ops, and how has it been an inspiration?
That one's kind of hard for me to say. I would say for the cooperatives already members of the Federation, I think Indian Spring is an ongoing example. It really kind of symbolizes one of the best democratic, strongest efforts we have. It's one of our co-op powerhouses. So it serves as an inspiration, as a model for the other cooperatives in the Federation who are really striving to do what Indian Springs does. Beyond our membership, I would say that in some respects it is, and I can only speak to that anecdotally, where often, no matter where I am or visiting, people will know about the Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, and in particular, Indian Springs as an inspiring example. I get young people who, after a visit there, really kind of talk my ear off about their experience and think about becoming farmers themselves. So to that extent, I would say yes, although I don't know of any particular study or whatnot that can kind of measure its impact, beyond that.
Okay.
Paul, if you don't mind, I'd like to
Absolutely
to follow on to Terence's. In what I'm about to say isn't necessarily specific to the Indian Springs Co-op, but I think part of the magic of the co-op community is that much of the co-op community receives inspiration from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and frankly are reminded about the power of cooperatives and the capacity to really empower again economically and societally, because it can be as cooperatives get larger and they get more mature, they begin to look to their non-cooperative competition within whatever sector they are, and there's this sort of tension of the classic cooperative identity and principles, and a business that has to perform within the market, within the free market, and it's just really important from my point of view, at least, to have the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and other cooperatives that sort of are able to serve as a lodestar for a reminder of what co-ops can really do and what they really mean.
I have to say, I have to thank you, Doug, for that, and I appreciate that, because that's one of the things when I talk about the need for enabling legislation. That's one of the examples I give, not necessarily the Federation, which I think is an inspiring example, but what you talked about in terms of as our cooperatives, penetrate into markets, they are naturally, clearly thrust into a competitive situation. They're competing with businesses that are not bound by any set of principles. Some would argue they're amoral. And so when you consider an organization that's trying to operate democratically, that has a concern for community, that's trying to do things in a almost a humanistic way, that could be seen as a disadvantage, and the lure, the seduction, if you will, to kind of dismantle one's cooperative values in order to what you believe better compete with these other traditional businesses can be quite strong and compelling. And these are the reasons I think this is another reason why I think we need to codify cooperative principles and have enabling legislation, because it sort of really strengthens the long-term and permanent values and principles that are embedded in cooperatives.
Thank you. I have another question for you, Terence, and I think, Doug, you'll want to chime in on this as well, but how does the Federation help those that have an interest in farming but don't have access to land? So I wanted to let you, Terence, take a shot at that one first, and then we can talk more broadly with Doug.
Well, as I mentioned in my comments, that's one of the big challenges we face, one of the big contradictions. On one hand, we have families that do own land, but the heirs of these lands are not necessarily interested in being farmers themselves. On the other hand, I'm seeing all the time a growing interest, especially among youngish Black folks who are interested in urban farming and even rural farming, but they lack their land less. So I think what we're really attempting to do here at the Federation is to see is how we can combine these particular segments of our community in order to meet their mutual needs. But there's no easy answer I can give you. There's no kind of shake and stir solution that I can provide right now, because that's one of the critical questions we're facing, especially as our farmers age out. What's the replacement going to look like? What's the new pipeline of young African-American growers? Where's that going to come from? I think we have to find some way to combine the assets that may lie fallow, owned by these heirs, but then also use the labor power of young, energized communities of color and put them together. We have to find out how to do that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. Terence and his colleagues do that work every day. Another thing that the Federation does do, I think probably better than any other entity, is make sure that those farmers who are interested in starting Black farmers who are interested in starting, that they understand the government programs that might help them. Now, the government programs they're not the cure-all, but USDA does have a significant number of farm loan programs in particular, as well as a few grant programs. And I know that the current USDA is intent on trying to make those programs work as good as possible. So that's, those do exist too. So
for you, Doug, are there any urban farming cooperatives? How are they different from rural cooperatives? You could talk a little bit about that difference.
Yeah, there are some, and I think some of the folks that Terence was referring to earlier, I'm guessing, Terence, are some people in cities, and whether they're certainly Black farmers, but others who are coming to the food system and want to have much more franchise in the way that their food is produced, and they want to be part of it. So we do see some urban farmer cooperatives. They tend to be relatively younger people, and it can be a bit of a challenge because farmers in rural areas tend to have there's infrastructure to move their products and to process their products, and in urban places the advantage, of course, is if you want to get right to the consumer or maybe right into a food co-op, it's right there. But if they want to get into into a larger kind of food supply chain, that it can be a little bit more difficult. But I think we're going to see more of those types of co-ops, and importantly, those USDA programs that I mentioned before, the farm programs, they're agnostic on whether the farmers are rural or urban. Those farmers just need to be able to, that they're doing work in food or fiber, they're growing food or fiber. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that because one of the projects that the Federation has worked on for a number of years is a project we call the Cleveland Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative, and this project really speaks to what you asked about, Paul, in that this project began with the recognition that there is a need, there is a desire, there's a demand in urban places by people of color, but also working class whites for more investment to participate in urban farming, which really wasn't present in Cleveland at that time. And I think Cleveland could be a good example of a lot of Rust Belt cities that have faced economic decline over the last 40, 50 years due to kind of neoliberal disinvestment. But people were really interested in how to bring resources there to support urban farming, and the Federation was able to work with NRCS and the USDA to get those resources there. And we fast forward, and what we did was really focus on a particular need, and that is the need to extend the growing season in these northern climates, especially during the winter. And the hoop houses, the high tunnels, enabled folks to do that. So it was through that provision of real material resources that started to help local growers. But then people started to think, well, I could use this hoop house to grow food for myself. But what if all of us, the hundreds of people with these high tunnels, started to think collectively on growing together? And that's the conversation that we're having now. It's like really asking people to think about how they could optimize the growing capacity of their individual piece of land and or hoop house, and work together and aggregate that and market that to create conditions for a strong cooperative. And we're pursuing that in other urban spaces as well. So I think that's one example or one option to really expand cooperative development, especially vis-a-vis agriculture in urban spaces.
Awesome. Thank you. I've got a couple more I want to ask. I think without going into the 1,100 pages of the tax law, if you could talk a little bit about how inheritance taxes discourage heirs from staying on farms. I think that's probably a question to start with Doug, but you may want to chime in on it as well, Terence.
Yeah, I will jump into that a little bit, and I might say something a little bit controversial here. Terence, Terence will be. I welcome any comment, either adding to or disagreeing. So inheritance taxes for smaller farmers, that's not an issue because of the level of exemption for estate taxes. And I used to have all those numbers in my head, but I think it's at least $5 million per individual, and up to so for a married couple it's 10 million. It might be more than that now. So for a farm that has a value of less than $10 million or maybe more, inheritance taxes or estate taxes are not a big issue. Not an issue at all, actually. So for a few, and it's actually not very many in the country, it is an issue on whether that farm would need to essentially be broken up so that they can pay the taxes. I think and Terence can speak to this much better than I, but the big issue, particularly for Black farmers, generational, is heirs property and the complications from lack of clarity on some of the ownership. But I'll stay away from that. So Terence.
Yeah, that's not really my wheelhouse. I think Dania would be better able to respond to that. But based on what I know about the cooperatives we're working with and the members thereof, I haven't in the 4 years I've been here, I haven't actually seen or experienced an instance where estate taxes became an issue, as Doug alluded to. When you're talking about properties valued at 10 million or more, that's just not a regular occurrence for the farmer members that we have. So heirs property, how to hold on to values or assets less than that is the crucial issue for our farmers.
All right. Thank you very much. I've got lots more questions, and I didn't get to ask my data questions. We got a historical resources question in the queue, but we may follow up on those separately. But I want to again thank you, Terence Courtney, for being with us today from the Federation of Southern Co-ops, and Doug O'Brien, thank you for your participation in our Wikipedia event today. And again, thanks to Jamie and Kirsten for getting us organized and having our panel session, presentations and panel question and answer session this morning. And I believe folks will be back at 12 noon for the edit-a-thon portion. And I'm going to see if Jamie has anything more or Kirsten has anything more that they have to say as part of a transition. But just thank you. Really appreciate the conversation, the presentations this morning.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.